So good morning, everyone. This morning, I want to talk about one of the five hindrances that the Buddha taught. And you may recall he taught five hindrances to our practice. Real quickly, they were sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, which is really sort of sluggishness and um, tiredness, uh, restlessness and worry, which we really call anxiety, and then the one I want to talk about today, which is doubt. And I think doubt's one of the biggies of the five. And, it's something that we encounter a lot, probably every day in some form, throughout our lives, throughout our practice, and it visits us at all kinds of times during when we get quiet and when we wake up in the middle of the night. It shows up when we are sitting down for meditation and our mind won't settle and we start to doubt whether this meditation is going anywhere. And it often shows up when life delivers us outcomes that we didn't anticipate or certainly don't welcome. It asks questions like, am I doing this right? Should I be doing this? Is this path leading somewhere? Am I fooling myself? And just a gazillion questions. And often, most painfully, it asks us, can I trust myself at all? Can I trust my decisions? Can I trust my judgment? And it is, as I said, probably, in my view, the top of the five hindrances, or at least the one that shows up most commonly. But but I want to be careful here because naming it a hindrance doesn't mean we should try to eliminate it or get rid of it or push it away or treat it as an enemy, even if we could, because that approach just doesn't work. I mean, we can do that, try as we might, it's going to keep coming back and biting us. So I want to explore this concept of the hindrance of doubt this morning in a little more nuanced way. That as something that when we meet it with wisdom can actually deepen our practice and move us along on the path. But there's a crucial distinction I'll make this morning, because not all doubt is the same. There's the kind of doubt that really seems to paralyze us. It's the spinning, obsessive uncertainty that can just freeze us, lock us up, make it impossible to make a decision, make us unable to commit to anything, unable to trust our own experience, unable to commit to a course of action. We're just thinking, oh, I can't decide. And this is the hindrance that the Buddha was really talking about. When the mind is caught in this endless loop of, but what if this, but what if that, but what if the other, never landing on anything long enough to really investigate it because we're just looping and looping and looping. The kind of doubt that just feeds on itself, doesn't seek answers. It seeks more questions, which is really becomes a way of avoiding the vulnerability of engagement, avoiding the vulnerability of making the wrong choice. So that's the first kind of doubt, if you will, the real kind that the Buddha was talking about as the hindrance. But I want to contrast it this morning with what I'm going to call healthy skepticism, and or what we might call wise questioning. Okay. And in fact, the Buddha encouraged this kind of doubt. There's a well-known sutta, the Kalamana Sutta, in which he instructed his monks, his followers, not to accept his teachings based merely on tradition, authority, or any logical reasoning, but to test these teachings against one's own experience. He's he's quoted as having said, quote, when you know for yourselves that these things are wholesome, blameless, praised by the wise, and when undertaking and practice lead to welfare and happiness, then you should engage in them, end quote. This is not the doubt as a hindrance. This is doubt as a doorway, a dharma door, if you will. The challenge for us is learning to distinguish between the two, and that the discernment there between distinguishing between doubt as a hindrance and doubt is a real important inquiry. Um, that's where discernment comes into play. Okay. But in neither case, however, let's keep in mind that the certainty we might be seeking in our lives, is not going to probably come from either one, nor is it even attainable necessarily. It's just not something that we're going to get much of in our lives in terms of certainty. And if we cling to the expectation of certainty, which certainly many of us crave, wish we could have, we're probably going to suffer because it's just not going to happen. Now, modern psychology has looked at this not surprisingly, and gives us a sort of a somewhat modern, if you will, framework to think about it. So we know from psychology research on anxiety and rumination that there's what psychology calls the paralytic form of doubt. And it has its roots in what we psychologists call the intolerance of uncertainty. There's that certainty thing again. The intolerance of uncertainty. The mind, in its desperate seeking of solid ground, spins faster and faster trying to resolve ambiguity, trying to reduce ambiguity. But here's the problem. Ambiguity is a fundamental part of the human experience. It is always with us in some form, even if we strongly dislike it, even if we would love certainty in our lives. And let's be clear, there are certain belief systems and traditions which offer what I consider the illusion of certainty to those believers. They may embrace it as certainty, but I find that confining, constraining, and actually somewhat of a bait and switch, where they offer it, but it's not really provided. But we cannot think our way to certainty. We just can't get there about most things that matter. Some of the modern therapy techniques show us that doubt attaches often to core beliefs about ourselves. And these are beliefs formed probably long before we even had the awareness or the mental capacity to even question them. These repetitive stories about ourselves that start very young. I'm not good enough. I can't trust my judgment. Someone will leave me if I make the wrong choice. Someone will dislike me if I say the wrong thing. When these deep, what we call schemas, are activated, doubt feels overwhelming because it's not even about the present situation at all. It's an old wound wearing a new mask. It's an old wound wearing a new mask, that kind of doubt. Some of you are familiar with the psychological school known as attachment theory, which also looks at doubt on a spiritual path. In other words, it says if our early attachment relationships, has taught us that support was unreliable, then we're probably going to find it extraordinarily difficult to trust a practice, to trust a teacher, to trust a community, or even trust our growing wisdom, because we grew up anxious about trusting anyone or anything. Now, recognizing this pattern is not a failure, it's not a defect. It is the practice because that's what we can hone in on. We see how clearly our past conditioning shapes our present experience. This is exactly what the Buddha was asking us to do. So with all that said, how do we actually work with doubt when it arises? What's a skillful way to work with it? So let's talk about some sort of practical ways that our practice provides us here. First, we want to name it and locate it in the body. Okay. Oh, doubt is arising. Where am I feeling it? Very often we feel it in our chest. Very often we feel it by tensing up or contracting. But when we notice it, here's our noticing. When we name it, we want to pause. We want to stop. And rather than just getting swept up in the content of these doubtful thoughts, we want to turn our attention to the body initially. What does it feel like as a physical experience? Where do I feel it? In the chest? Is my stomach churning? In my throat? Is my throat clenching a little bit? Okay. Very often when doubt arises, there's the kind of what I call doubtful anxiety that manifests as a tightness, a constriction, a sense of groundlessness. But if we bring our attention into the body, we can often step out of the thought loop and into direct experience. Let me say that again. When we bring our attention about whatever we're doubting in that moment into the body, it helps us get out of that ruminative tape loop and back into the experience. We move from being lost in doubt and just consumed by doubt to being aware of doubt. Oh, there's doubt arising. And that alone, that recognition can begin to change things. So that's step number one. Second, and very importantly, we ask ourselves, what is this doubt protecting me from? Because paralytic doubt almost always serves a protective function. This is what I mean. If I never commit to something, I'll never fail. If I don't study for the test and fail it, I can say it's because I didn't study, I didn't commit. If I never trust someone, I can never be betrayed or hurt. That's the protective function. So if we act on the doubt, if I never believe in my own progress, I can never face disappointment or setbacks or stagnation. All of those things have this sort of weird protective function when we allow doubt to consume us. And often when we begin to inquire into that protective function, when we begin to look at it, we'll see there's fear beneath it. But fear, unlike doubt, is something that we can hold more easily, I think, with compassion. It's just easier to say, oh, I'm afraid that I'm going to fail. I'm afraid that I'm going to be hurt. I'm afraid that I'm not going to make progress. It's just been my experience that's a little easier to hold with compassion than doubt, which just keeps looping and looping endlessly. Okay. So that's the second strategy, if you will. The third is what I call a return to direct experience. Okay. And this is the one that shows up in the suttas, in the classical teachings of the Buddha, where he's talking about investigation of our doubt. And he doesn't mean an intellectual analysis here. He means turning toward our actual lived experience and asking, what is true right now? What do I know in this moment that might counter the doubt? You know, when I put all the things in column A and column B and C, what do I know? Where does it line up? What I do know in the moment is the breath is happening. I know my awareness is present. I know that sitting there making this effort to practice, there's an orientation towards clarity. So we start with that and then we build from it. So we start with this investigation, like, okay, what are the barriers here? What is, where is this landing in the body? All the things I've already talked about. And then fourthly is we practice in community. And this is one of the reasons the Buddha established the Sangha as one of the three refuges. Doubt thrives in isolation. It loops in isolation. It's like a tape that won't stop repeating. It loops in our brains, but when we say it out loud to others, when we say it out loud to our community, it just loses its power. Because one of the beauties of Sangha is when we practice together, when we share honestly our struggles, first of all, we see that doubt is universal, and that recognition alone loosens the grip of it. It makes us less powerful. And then we benefit from the faith of others that we can manage our doubt and overcome our doubt when our own faith is wavering. This is wisdom in action, bringing it to the Sangha. We are interdependent beings. We all suffer from this. We can try to hide it and pretend we don't. But when we lean on our community during times of doubt, it's one of the most skillful things we can do. And it happens here every week. We bring it in. People talk about their doubts. They talk about where they're stuck. They talk about where they're challenged. So community. And then fifth is cultivating patience with ourselves about our doubts. This path is long. It is bumpy. It is not linear. There are periods of clarity and periods of confusion and real doubt. There are periods of deep faith in the practice, and then periods of profound uncertainty about the practice. And any of us that have been at this a while, boy, have we seen it ebb and flow. But that's not a sign that there's anything wrong. It is the path itself. That is the very nature of it. It is smooth walking in some instances, and it is rocky as the Dickens in other instances. You know, if Ajahn Chah and some of the great forest monastics in Thailand, especially, you know, they talk about how they spend years working with doubt, not bypassing it, but walking slowly through it with patience and determination. Okay. So all that said, I want to close with a metaphor, one of my favorite gardening metaphors, and here what I'm going to suggest is when we take what appears to be waste, scraps, decay, leftover food, we compost it, and given time and given the right conditions, the composting transforms that into the richest soil. And that is the very ground from which new life springs. And doubt is just like this. When we don't run from it, when we don't let it paralyze us, we let it compost, we let it sit sometimes. When we hold it with patience and curiosity, it will and can break down into something nourishing. And very often that is greater acceptance, greater humility, greater openness, and the refusal to cling to views, especially around doubt, that no longer serve us because we recognize them. We recognize the futility of just recycling our doubts. And this deepens our practice. It deepens our faith in our practice. And I don't mean blind faith, you know, but faith that has been tested in the fire of honest questioning and has emerged stronger. So what I would invite you to do is welcome doubt next time it visits. And it may even happen today. It happens all the time. Whether that's about your practice, about your life, about your relationships, about the way you're training your dog, about yourself. Just follow some of these steps. Stop, pause, look at it, investigate it. Not to indulge it, not to, because that's not what we're talking about. Not to be swept away by it, but just to sit with it as you would initially sit with a difficult guest. And as Rumi often suggests, even offered a cup of tea. So those are some thoughts this morning. Ask what doubt needs from us when it shows up. Trust that our willingness to be present with uncertainty itself is part of the path. It's just recognizing that it's not a weakness, it's not a failing, it's just part of the deal. But we can work skillfully with the doubt. We don't have to be consumed by it. All right.